Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to SIEPS, Swedish Institute for European Policy Studies. My name is Jakob Levander, and I'm a researcher in political science here at the Institute. Today, we're hosting a seminar on European strategic autonomy. It's based on a new SIEPS report called Strategic Autonomy, Views from the North. SIEPS is an autonomous government agency, and our aim is to be a link between academia and policymakers. We try to identify policy issues and political currents that transform the European Union, its system of multi-level governance, and have a profound impact on policies throughout the Union. Against this backdrop, few of us has escaped the debate on strategic autonomy. This concept has been the main driver of a discussion on how the EU can better manage in a rapidly changing world. Also, it is certainly a topic that has the potential to deepen European integration in many ways, but also one that spurs division and friction. A union that strives for more autonomy and capabilities in various fields of policy or sovereignty, depending on who you're talking to, will surely alter the status quo and generate great enthusiasm, energies, but also suspicion and friction among member states. That is precisely what we're here to talk about today. The North of the Union has traditionally, first and foremost, sought to protect the integrity of the single market, safeguard EU competition rules against protectionism, and defend free trade. Another area of doubt from the North is the further integration of EU foreign and security policy. To address these issues, SIEPS has asked 4 authors to make sense of how strategic autonomy and its many policy proposals are perceived in Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. The end result is a report with 3 chapters, and today we have the authors with us to account for their findings and to discuss these findings with our special guest, Kristi Raik, director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. Responsible for the Danish chapter is Christine Nissen, researcher at DIS, Danish Institute for International Studies. Finland requires 2 authors, which are Tuomas Isomarkku, who's a research fellow at FIA, Finnish Institute of International Affairs, along with Niklas Helvig, leading researcher at FIA. And on Sweden, we have Kalle Håkansson, who's doing his PhD at Malmö University, and he's also an associate fellow at Swedish Institute for International Affairs. We will have presentations of these 3 respective countries from our 4 authors, which will be followed by comments from Kristi. After that, I will kick off a hopefully dynamic discussion by addressing some questions to our panel. But for now, without further ado, I now turn to Christine to give us some Danish insights. The floor is yours, Christine.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you very much, SIEPS, for hosting this very timely event. Begin with giving you a brief assessment of the Danish understanding of current global politics to sort of provide a baseline for understanding the Danish stance on European strategic autonomy. So first of all, a significant part of the Danish self-understanding when it comes to foreign and security policy is that Denmark is a small country that depends on others. Denmark depends on the American security guard, Europe's defense, and we are also desperately holding on to the belief that the US is now back and that Trump was just a small bump on the road. And as a small open economy that is not highly diversified, Denmark also depends very much on European and global export markets to be as open and liberal as possible. Denmark also depends on multilateral organizations because they allow us to reduce power asymmetry and decrease the transaction costs of diplomacy. But these constants in Danish foreign policy, the US, free trade, multilateral organizations, are less stable than they've been for decades, and the current security context, as perceived by Danish foreign policy or policymakers, are definitely in a state of flux. So although we are very much clinging on to the hope that we can count on the US again, the Danes are not blind to the fact that American foreign policy interests today are more Asia than Europe. And we also acknowledge that the multilateral system is under severe pressure and that global power competition is here to stay. And in such a complex security context where the need for European autonomous action is increasingly becoming widely shared across European capitals, Denmark also finds itself in a tricky spot, especially when it comes to sort of security and defense policy. First of all, Denmark has a defense opt-out, which means that we're not part of aspects of the EU's military cooperation. And then there's this long-standing inclination for American leadership. And indeed, right now, we have probably the most EU-skeptic government that we have had for quite a while. And that means that Denmark may risk getting sidelined when other member states are strengthening their common defense policy. And I will go back a little bit to this defense opt-out, because it means a lot for the Danish self-understanding when it comes to defense policy in Europe, obviously, but also this debate on strategic autonomy. Denmark got it in 1993, so before the EU even had security and defense policy. And it was after the Danish no to the Maastricht Treaty in 92. And even though there weren't an actual EU policy on defense, the Danish debate was very much about, at this time, the fear that EU in time would be able to develop an EU army, a supranational army, and that Denmark would have to give up sovereignty in this field. And ever since then, and also very much when it comes to the current debate on strategic autonomy, there has been this general sort of hesitation towards any type of strengthening of EU's defense cooperation. That said, Denmark also supports some aspects of this quest for European strategic autonomy. And as one of the officials that I interviewed for this particular report put it, we agree 100% with the content of the concept, strategic autonomy. But the rhetoric around it is toxic. And of course, Denmark is not the only country that are not wild about the term autonomy. You also mentioned this in your introduction, Jacob, but the surprising aspect about this particular quote is the first part, namely that Denmark agrees 100% with the contents of strategic autonomy. This is a new perspective from a Danish point of view. Here, Danes or Denmark, Danish policymakers see that there is an increasing need for the EU to be capable of protecting its interest on the global stage, not least when it comes to issues that goes beyond sort of territorial defense, but also within the sort of realm of security and defense, such as hybrid warfare, cyber threats, migration, and while we have seen previous governments, Danish governments, to sort of be very restrictive when it comes to the application of this Danish defense opt-out. So if anything just smells a little bit of defense, then the Danes are out. This is changing now. So there's definitely a move towards Denmark trying to increase its room of maneuver on EU defense cooperation. And this is, of course, also because there has happened a lot. The EU has strengthened its defense cooperation quite a lot in the recent years. And many of these initiatives are in a form where the Danish opt-out does not apply. So Denmark is actually for the first time able to participate in much EU defense cooperation. All the activities that happens under the EU Commission's fields of competences. So the Defense Fund, military mobility, and so on. Denmark is allowed to participate because the opt-out only includes cooperation within sort of the strict term of the EU's CSDP, the EU's Common Security and Defence Policy. So that means that the opt-out is not an all-exclusive measure. And yeah, for the first time ever, Denmark is actually participating in EU defence policy. Denmark is also very much compelled to retain the opt-out as a sovereignty guarantee. This has always been the perspective, that we want to keep our sovereignty and participate in EU policy when sort of we get something out of it. And this is the case now. We would like to retain our sovereignty while also participating to the extent possible in the expanded defense cooperation in EU. So and I think on that fairly ambiguous note, I will end my story here, at least for now, about Denmark. So thank you, Jacob.
Thanks a lot. What would the north of Europe be without ambiguity? I'm sure we will come back to these issues as the seminar approaches question time. Thanks a lot, Christine. Thomas, over to you from Finland.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you, SIEPS, for this opportunity to present our findings. Like Christine, I would also like to start by saying a few words about how Finland sees the world, as that's how Niklas and I also started our analysis. We looked at major Finnish foreign and security and defense policy documents and analyzed how Finland's view of the world has changed over the last 15 to 20 years. And we could say that Finland generally recognizes all of the same trends that have underpinned this discussion about strategic autonomy at the EU level. So in the last 5 to 10 years, Finland has grown increasingly worried about the situation, both in its own neighborhood and in international politics more broadly. In both of these contexts, both in the Baltic Sea region and in international politics in general, Finland sees increasing great power competition, weakening commitment to multilateral cooperation and multilateral rules, and also increasing use of tools such as geoeconomics and hybrid influencing. What has stayed the same pretty much over the whole time period we looked at is Finland's strong belief in the EU's role as a foreign and security policy actor. So for Finland, EU membership has from the very beginning had this kind of a very strong security dimension. It was not as explicit at the beginning as it is now, but it has always been there. And like I said, this dimension has only strengthened recently. However, in addition to being a strong supporter of the EU as a global actor, as a foreign and security policy actor, as a security provider, in addition to that, Finland has also sought to advance its security in other frameworks. Like Sweden, Finland has deepened its ties with NATO. There's also deepening bilateral cooperation between Finland and Sweden. Finland has joined most of the different defense cooperation frameworks that are now that have been introduced outside the EU framework, the French-led European Intervention Initiative, the UK-led Joint Expeditionary Force, the German-led Framework Nations concept. And all of this that I've described above is also reflected in Finland's views on strategic autonomy. So, first of all, very much in line with its traditional support for the EU's role as a foreign security policy actor and as a security provider, Finland has been highly supportive of the different defense initiatives that we have seen in the EU during the last 5 years or so. However, Finland has also been very pragmatic when it comes to these initiatives. If we look at Finland's participation in the different PESCO projects, Finland actually ranks at the lower end of the member states when it comes to the number of projects it participates in. So currently, Finland is a full member of only 5 of these PESCO projects, which is quite a small number. From the very beginning, Finland has also worked towards PESCO not being this kind of an exclusive EU exercise, but very much in line with its commitment or its participation in other defense frameworks. It has hoped that PESCO could be open to third states as well. When it comes to the European Defence Fund, I think the Finland's position here has been similarly pragmatic. So in general, Finland has been very supportive of this initiative. At the same time, there has been some concern that the EDF could potentially distort the functioning of the European defense market, strengthen the role of the defense industries of the big EU member states, since Finland's own defense industry mostly consists of very small firms. Finland has wanted this European Defence Fund to actually enhance competition within the European defence market and also give those smaller defence enterprises a chance. And in addition to its support for EU defence cooperation, Finland is also strongly in favor of a capable NATO and a strong US presence in Europe, as it sees both of these as essential for its own security as well. Unlike many Atlanticist EU member states, like Denmark, for example, Finland does not see these two things as contradicting each other. So instead, there is this very strong argument that both of them can complement and strengthen each other. So strong EU defense and strong NATO are not considered as contradictions. Finland is also strongly in favor of deepening EU-NATO cooperation. Overall, I would say that Finland is simply in favor of strengthening European capabilities. The framework itself does not matter that much, but of course the EU remains very important for Finland. When it comes to the area of common foreign and security policy, Finland has also been supportive of initiatives that could strengthen that part. Finland is in favor of widening the use of qualified majority voting, constructive abstention. Would also like to see the High Representative have a bigger role and a more prominent role. It gets then trickier when we talk about this kind of more informal ways of advancing European foreign security policy cooperation. So the idea of a European Security Council has been viewed somewhat critically as that could potentially take place outside formal EU structures and institutions. And as a small member state, this kind of cooperation would not be in Finnish interest. But overall, in the area of foreign security policy, we also see that Finland is rather supportive of all these initiatives that are now part of this European strategic autonomy debate. But there are some concerns, and there are also some caveats. I now hand over to Niklas, who will talk about the economic side of things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Thomas. I guess it tells already a lot that you need two researchers to explain the position of the smallest Nordic member state, at least by population. So maybe that tells you already something about how difficult the debate sometimes is here. But yeah, so as Thomas said, I'm just going to say a few words about the economic perspective. And I would say that compared to the defense and foreign policy aspects that Thomas mentioned, in the sphere of economic and trade policies, actually Finland is the most skeptical when it comes to strategic autonomy and the ideas that are connected to it. So as was already explained, of course, Finland recognizes also these economic challenges that stem, for example, from the great power competition between the US and China, China's economic assertiveness, and also the technological competition more widely that we see. But it is worried about some protectionist undertones that are in the strategic autonomy debate. So it's worried about possible protectionist measures that might be a part of the recipes to counter these challenges. And especially because many of the officials that we talked to, they said that they fear that this might only lead to countermeasures and that there might be a spiraling of trade barriers and protectionist measures around the world as a consequence. So the government's report on EU policy that came out earlier this year is quite outspoken on this and said that strategic autonomy should not be a euphemism for protectionism. So when it comes to these problems of external dependencies and the security implications of that, for example, when we looked at the COVID-19 crisis and some of the shortcomings we saw there in international supply chains, Finland always strongly emphasizes its model of security of supply. It's a very Finnish concept, but that's how they want to approach this management of risks that stem from global interdependencies, and that focuses a lot on national preparedness, on cooperation between the public and the private sector, but it is less focused on trade barriers or any kind of interventionist policy. So it is a very kind of market-focused approach still. So yeah. As mentioned, Finland doesn't think that it needs more drastic measures such as reshoring of industries, because something like this would always mean and implicate that the state needs a larger function in organizing market actors. And the same principle also goes to the EU's industrial policies. There is a lot of talk and initiative coming from continental Europe on an overhaul, for example, of the industrial policy to focus on European champions when it comes to certain industries and technologies. And Finland is rather skeptical about anything that would undermine the competitiveness of the single market and antitrust measures, and rather wants to focus on the deepening of the single market. For example, in the sphere of the digital single market, it is in favor of completing the single market, and thus also have a good basis for its small and medium sized enterprises that Finland mostly is having to compete in the single market, and then basically also by that be competitive internationally. Lastly, there's also this connection in the strategic autonomy debate that economic instruments should be used to advance European interests and especially also European norms. So, for example, there's this idea of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or actually a proposal of the carbon border adjustment mechanism to push the global green agenda and use economic tools for the advancing of for example, green norms. And Finland is also having some doubts about this. At least the officials that we talk to, that economic instruments should not be the primary tool for advancing norms. For example, when it comes to the green agenda, but also when it comes to human rights. But that there are also other multilateral and diplomatic approaches to approach these questions. So, yeah, to sum up, yes, Finland is in general in favor of a strong and capable EU, more like a picture of strategic autonomy for a capable EU, not so much strategic autonomy from international actors or global trade flows. But it sees a lot of the recipes to get to strategic autonomy differently than, for example, ideas that come from France or even maybe Germany. And in particular, it emphasizes international partnerships when it comes to defense and open trade and liberal trade agenda.
Thanks a lot, Thomas and Niklas. Incidentally, I know that your chapter is called Strategic Autonomy, Yes, But Suspense. And I think that Thomas just gave us the yes part and Niklas provided us with the hold on a minute part. I'm sure we'll get back to industrial policy as we move along. But now over to you, Kalle. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you, Jacob. I must say it has really been a pleasure to contribute to this publication and to this event today. So in this presentation, I'll try to give you kind of the essence of my chapter. So I'll divide it into kind of 3 or 4 small parts. Firstly, to start off with, I think it's important to remember where kind of the concept were developed. In a way, we can go back to the late 90s. However, the big push came with the global strategy of 2016, which strongly outlined strategic autonomy as a goal for the Union. And hence, here I think it's important to see how Sweden, which quite strongly lies within the transatlantic group of EU member states, and which in recent years has also developed and strengthened its defense relations with the US, were worried that this development and the notion of strategic autonomy could harm the relations with the US. It's also quite interesting to see, but also fully rational in a way, to see, if we look to kind of the different security threats of today, how Sweden is, at least in part, more than some NATO allies, underlining that EU efforts should not kind of duplicate the work of NATO. Likewise, the Swedish defense industry is partly owned or affiliated with actors from the UK and US. And this is important to remember as kind of the mainly defense industrial new initiatives, such as the European Defence Fund and the member state-led PESCO, were kind of developed under the lead motif of strategic autonomy. Hence, Sweden saw this notion of strategic autonomy within the defense field as a risk for its defense industry. And for instance, the defense minister, Peter Hultqvist, quite strongly underlined that Sweden opposes European strategic autonomy in industrial terms. So hence, I think it's important to emphasize this to be able to understand the kind of the first quite critical outlook on strategic autonomy from the Swedish side. And so kind of the concept and these discussions has been viewed with suspicion and hesitancy from the political parties in Sweden, both in the government, but also overall in the parliament. Swedish representatives have been very reluctant to use the concept in public and have actually kind of tried to remove the concept from council conclusions in the EU setting. However, since the global strategy, the concept has been kind of expanded to other policy fields, such as trade, economic issues, health issues, climate, digitalization, among others. This is part and effect of kind of the pandemic, but this development was there even before the pandemic, I would say, as well. And we can also see that the policy field of security and defense are increasingly become blurred with other policy areas, such as trade and technology and so on. And this overall kind of influenced the direction of the EU. So kind of one of the fights on strategic autonomy that Sweden took in this regard was in the discussions on the the EU budget and the Next Generation EU package, teaming up, as you all know, with the Frugals, a group that were very critical about the kind of discussion on strategic autonomy in this debate. However, in the end, kind of accepted the financial package with some adjustments. But I think this is important. I think it's important to remember that this is a Brexit effect as well for Sweden. Sweden, or the Nordic states, in a sense, lost the UK as its market liberal, free trading, budget restrictive partner within the EU. And I think that this will have a strong impact in the long run on Swedish EU policy. But also the pandemic also pushed forward discussion on strategic autonomy in regard to both the EU's trade policy and the working of the internal market. And within these discussions, Sweden has taken a very clear position in defense of an open and rules-based trade policy, and argued that the EU must be a strong voice for multilateralism and free trade globally. And we can see that Sweden have kind of put together like-minded groups like the Stockholm 8 initiative, or have joined groups like the Friends of the Single Market to kind of fight off these kind of protectionist tendencies. But nevertheless, the pandemic, but also kind of the overall changed geopolitical situation, ambitions from the EU institutions, large member states such as France and Germany, as well as kind of the loss of the UK has firmly put the notion of strategic autonomy in kind of the EU's rhetoric for a long time, I would argue. And consequently, this is now where we maybe are seeing a more kind of proactive shift from the Swedish side now. For instance, the Swedish EU minister, Hans Dahlgren, in the government's EU declaration this year, argued that in some areas strategic autonomy must be protected without the EU turning inwards. And I also think that a senior official in the Prime Minister's office put this quite well when they argued that kind of the best way for Sweden to have influence and steer the direction of the EU is to kind of enter into discussions on strategic autonomy and kind of try to turn it into what we want it to be about. And I very much agree with this approach, as we are likely to continue to see these discussions and ambitions towards strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty as outlined by the new German government and just last week by President Macron as a focus area for the French EU presidency. Hence, I think it's important that Sweden kind of more proactively seeks to contribute to these discussions and kind of outlines its overall ambitions and thinking on kind of the development of the EU, but also outline its different red lines, try to build new groupings and have new ideas to kind of influence the EU going forward. Thirdly, now I'll try to go into some of the policy areas where we can see, at least in part, this new stance from the Swedish side. In regard to trade and internal markets, Sweden will continue to have a clear and strong position in promoting free trade and arguing for kind of the importance of an open European economy. Yet one shift we can see is that Sweden in the coming years will put in place a new national screening mechanism for foreign direct investment. This was actually something that Sweden had before joining the EU and dropped, and now it will be put in place again. Likewise, the government has expressed its support for ways of enhancing crisis preparedness, for instance, having joint storages of important resources or expanding or broadening value and supply chains. Another point is that Sweden, which traditionally is very restrictive and hesitant of kind of state aid, have argued that the so-called important projects of common European interest could be a way forward for the Union, but with the caveat that that we should only do this when we see market failures, and it should also be used quite restrictively. Finally, kind of coming back to kind of the traditional security and defense development, then we can see that Sweden has an ambition to strengthen the EU's foreign and security policy. One idea from the Swedish government is to strengthen the EU's voice in the world, is to use qualified majority voting in certain foreign policy areas. However, the government has said that while they're arguing for kind of the strengthening of the EU within this domain, the government underlines that the EU security and defense policy cooperation should be complementary and mutually reinforcing with the work of NATO, transatlantic cooperation, as well as Sweden's other kind of regional, bilateral and multilateral defense formats. And also a point on kind of this ongoing strategic compass process for security and defense then, which actually will be discussed this week in the European Council, which also will be the first European Council for the new Swedish Prime Minister. And we can see that Sweden overall in this process has outlined the need for a balance between strengthening both the military and the civilian side of the EU's CSDP. We can also see that the government has been critical of one of the most noticeable ideas from the compass, the development of a new EU rapid deployment capacity with up to 5,000 troops, especially as the battle groups has never been used. We'll also next semester, during the spring, see EU Defence Summit co-hosted by von der Leyen and President Macron to kind of create more impetus for security and defense policy integration. And it will be interesting to see if this could kind of spill over to the Swedish 2023 EU presidency. But then to conclude then with some kind of observations or recommendations, we can see that in its 2021 statement of EU policy, the government outlined that it wanted to be fully engaged in the core of the EU and to have influence that exceeds its size. And I would say that this shift that I've tried to describe here, becoming more publicly and positively engaged in the debate on strategic autonomy, could be a way could arguably be in light of this ambition of becoming a more influential member state. Yet one thing that I think that Sweden needs to take into consideration is this new political context that we are now witnessing after Brexit, but also due to kind of the geopolitical shifts in the world. Hence, it would be important to think for Sweden, but also for other Nordic states, I would guess, on what this kind of new political context mean, and does this development risk to kind of marginalize Sweden's position within the Union? I also expect that in the long run, the discussion on strategic autonomy could also kind of spill over to the debate on deepening of the Eurozone. Consequently, what will Sweden's kind of informal opt-out from the Euro mean for our ability kind of to steer and influence EU policy going forward? And I think that these questions should be more discussed and analyzed in the Swedish context and debate. Nevertheless, and to conclude, I argue that it's very welcome and necessary that Sweden now more actively and publicly engage in the debate on strategic autonomy. Hence, I think, as the name of my chapter suggests, that we will see an engaged Stockholm that, however, also will have different red lines on strategic autonomy. But with that, I will conclude. And thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kalle. And thank you for bringing up Brexit again. I had almost forgotten, but now I feel much more refreshed. Let's talk about that some more later on. And I think there are many issues that we will pick up on, especially on the notion of engagement, but the red lines. And I think I've noticed some red lines in the presentations of our friends from before over here. But now let's turn to Kristi from Estonia, and let's see what is your assessment of all this. Can you bring us some wisdom and perhaps some foresight? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jakob. And first of all, congratulations to CIEPS and to all the authors of the report. It's an important contribution to this ongoing discussions on what European strategic autonomy is about and what's the way forward. And I really enjoyed reading it. It is very rich in detail, and being quite familiar myself with the discussions and having been taking part in lots of discussions on strategic autonomy, especially during this year, I still found some new details that were interesting. And the report is actually about much more than the European strategic autonomy. It really gives a very broad and detailed framework that is kind of around this concept in the Nordic countries, and including then the description of the threat perceptions and understanding of the Nordic countries, Nordic EU members, about how the global security environment and regional security environment has been changing, and also about how these three Nordic countries see their position in the EU and their ability to influence the development of the EU and what kind of contribution they want to make. And that was one of the surprise moments to me to find out how strongly Sweden now stresses the aspiration to be at the EU's core. And then again, Denmark, having currently, as Christine said, the most Eurosceptic government since a long time. But I must say that during my own latest trip to Copenhagen, I actually heard myself, the Danish Prime Minister, saying that Denmark aspires to be at the EU's core. So we have this interesting situation with all the three Nordic member states wanting to be at the core, and even Sweden and Denmark that are not among the most integrated member states. So it might not sound like the natural choice of words, but this seems to be the way to signal that we want to make a difference, we want to have a say on where the EU is going. For Finland, it is a more like long-standing idea that Finland needs to be at the EU's core. And also in the Finnish case, it has usually meant that Finland is going along with the different initiatives and is part of the most integrated group of countries. So that's would be like one way to understand the core. And while this description of the context is very rich, I think the report also reflects the state of the discussion on strategic autonomy, in the sense that when we go to the level of detail, it is actually not that clear what this whole thing is about. And there are different views. And as I've said before, I mean, the very notion of strategic autonomy, it's very much aspirational. And when, for example, a Danish official says, according to the report, that Denmark agrees to the content, I have the question, so what exactly? What is the content? And even looking at the three Nordic countries, there are some very clear commonalities. I think that is a very obvious conclusion from the report. This emphasis on the open economy and competition, having the single market deepened, but not in the way of protectionism, and also a common view when it comes to security and defense, that more should be done in the EU framework, but this should not come at the cost of the transatlantic relationship, which is important for all the Nordic countries. But still, in spite of the rather similar threat assessments of the Nordic countries, there are still differences when it comes to the responses or ways to deal with this same security environment. And coming from Estonia myself and following a lot discussions on the regional security environment here, I think one of the like intriguing questions is, what is then the EU's contribution to addressing the most pressing concerns regarding our regional security environment, the security in the Baltic Sea region, where, according to the assessments of all the Nordic countries, there has been a clear deterioration after 2014, then we have seen different ways of the Nordics to kind of respond to that, such as Sweden having now the largest increase of defense spending, and Finland has always taken its defense capabilities very seriously, but Finland also kind of paying a lot of attention to defense and deterrence capacity. And then, in addition to the kind of more traditional military type of threat, you have this whole set of so-called hybrid methods of influence. And in addition, also the use of economic tools by great powers. And here we speak more about China. The use of economic tools as a way to gain political impact. So as you say in the report, it's a very kind of complex, multifaceted picture of threats. And I think it is not that clear what the EU then brings into this situation. And the expectations among the three Nordic countries are to some extent different. For example, in the case of Finland, there is a very strong wording in the latest Finnish security strategy, which is quoted also in the report, that the EU must be capable of taking responsibility for the security of its own territory and neighboring areas. This is a very strong statement on what Finland expects the EU to contribute. But I read this formulation also as a kind of indication that we are not there yet. The EU must be. It's an aspiration. But then you come to the question, what kind of capabilities does the EU has to kind of contribute? And I'm afraid on this particular point and the way it is worded, the Finnish view is actually different from, I think, all other member states. This particular reference to territory is also interesting, because that's one issue where whether you ask the French or Italians or Germans or whoever, actually everyone says that territorial defense remains responsibility of NATO or member states if they are not NATO members. So this is one of the points where we see difference. Where the Nordic views are more similar, and again, talking about regional security, it's this whole notion of hybrid threats and how to strengthen our resilience vis-a-vis hybrid threats. And here, I think there is a broad agreement that this is where the EU can contribute, and it should continue to build a more strong role in responding to various types of hybrid threats, be it cyber or disinformation or election interference or the use of migration as a kind of hybrid tool of influence. So that's where I believe there is a common agenda, and also an understanding that in the field of hybrid threats, this tension between the EU and NATO is not that kind of relevant, or there seems to be a much better cooperation and more natural division of labor in this field between the two organizations. Then again, when we look at capabilities, especially military capabilities, that's a much more tricky question. And first of all, it has to be, of course, mentioned that the EU does not have capabilities, it's the member states that do. And we have this slogan of a single set of forces that then member states use in different frameworks. It can be EU, it can be NATO, it can be a UN operation, it can be national, of course, defense. And here the kind of practical contribution of the EU seems to be quite minimal thus far. And it's reflected in this decision of Finland so far only to join 2 PESCO projects, and specifically joining the projects that actually do strengthen Finland's own national defense capability. And I think this is a very it's a pragmatic and very understandable view in a way, that that's what member states expect from EU security and defense policy, that it should strengthen their security and it should somehow address their most pressing security concerns. And then you inevitably have differences between what the member states prioritize and what they want to do in the EU framework, because their national security concerns are different to some extent. Then one more issue, civilian crisis management, that seems to be still a strong priority for Sweden, but I haven't heard that much about it lately in the Finnish discussions on EU security and defense. I remember it used to be a big topic also for Finland. So that's another area where the EU traditionally has been quite strong, and the Nordic countries, especially Sweden and Finland, have made a strong contribution and kind of pushed this issue forward. But when we look at the actual EU CSDP operations over the past decade or so, there has been a growing political attention to the need to have harder capabilities and also be able to do military operations. Majority of the operations continued to be civilian, but the actual contribution of member states to the civilian operations diminished. And so this is one question I have, then what is happening to this priority of a more civilian approach to dealing with crises and conflicts? Is it still seen as a particular advantage and strength of the EU, or has the political focus clearly moved to the kind of harder end of policies and instruments where the EU remains relatively weak and where there's an obvious need to strengthen European capabilities? And finally, a word on different groupings of member states. It's, of course, clear that France is the one that has been most actively pushing this whole concept of strategic autonomy and has been quite successful in kind of defining the frame of the debate at the EU level and kind of defining this level of ambition and aspiration, and also bringing its own security concerns to the EU agenda. And then the other member states somehow have to relate to that and find their way to kind of define their positions in relation to what has been proposed by France. And it seems Finland is pretty much like somewhere in the middle between the different national views, looking at all the member states. Denmark is more at the other extreme because of its opt-outs naturally. Sweden is, I think, somewhere between Denmark and Finland. But I think in order for this strategic autonomy process in the EU to move forward and to kind of become more acceptable to all member states, it has to find a better geographical balance and a better kind of way to actually respond to the expectations of different member states and different parts of Europe. And that's where then the Nordic countries come with their own perspective. Of course, the Baltics come with their own, which has some similarities with the Nordic views. And I think we still also continue the discussion on concepts, although we are kind of so tired of it, arguing whether it's autonomy, what it means, how to define it, is it the right concept or not. But we can't kind of completely leave it behind. And it was very interesting to notice that the new German coalition agreement, for example, doesn't use the concept of strategic autonomy, it's strategic sovereignty. But then again, the Nordics would rather prefer strategic responsibility, whereas sovereignty, I believe, in the Nordic context is much more a concept attached to the nation state and something that you don't so naturally want to use at the EU level. So the choice of concepts, I think it still also remains an issue and something we can also see in the report. But I will stop here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kristi. And it's very interesting that you mentioned this last bit, because it was quite ironic that when the Nordic member states, or at least viewed from here, from Sweden, seem to be sort of on board with using the term open strategic autonomy. After some years of debate, the Germans come out and go back to the word sovereignty again. And we'll see what happens from now on, but it was quite ironic to see. I want to pick up on one thing that you, just before we let in everybody, I wanted to ask you something more about the group, country groupings and so on. I mean, reviewing these cases from where you are sitting, he sees spheres of agreement between these Nordic cases and from Estonia and possibly the larger Baltic region, depending on the issues and the policy areas that you would like to discuss. I mean, should we really be talking about a Nordic Baltic view on strategic autonomy in different policy areas? And could you tell us about some crucial dividing lines? Is there a variable geometry here to be dealt with in the north as a bigger concept with the Nordic Baltic regions as a loose club of friends? Does it apply here?
Yes, thank you. We even did a short paper earlier this year with Niklas involved on the Nordic Baltic views and pointing to the same similarities that arise from your report on the kind of basics of open economy, single market with free competition, and transatlantic relationship. The Nordic Baltic views are very much the same. And then when you go to more detail, there might be more differences. But speaking about security and defense, which is more familiar to me, I think the more we go to concrete initiatives, the more we actually agree. And that's, I think, also the hope for the strategic autonomy process, that when it gets more to the kind of pragmatic phase of actually implementing agreed projects, it's less divisive than when we stay at the level of kind of political debates. And where the Baltic states have a particularly strong emphasis, of course, is this point that whatever the EU does in defense cooperation should not compete with NATO. It has to be complementary. But even this is a common position, and it's actually stated in EU documents very many times. So in a sense, it has been agreed. There is no doubt about that. But still, we know that the political positions of different member states are still to some extent different on this issue. And some would like to the EU to focus more on developing autonomous capabilities. But here, I think a common view from the Nordic Baltic region is that the EU defense initiatives really have to live up to this rhetoric of EU defense cooperation, also strengthening NATO and also contributing to what NATO is doing.
Thanks a lot. If nobody wants to jump on that, I will throw out a few questions, and you can raise your hands or shout out in any way possible, or I will direct them directly to you, and then you can bounce up from each other. There is one thing that we touched lightly on, but I think is quite central to what most of these yes, but logic that runs through, I think, all three chapters is about, and it's about industrial strategy, industrial policy, and its connection with perceptions of protectionism. I mean, it looks like this is the big black hole in some ways for many of these countries. I would like to know whether there's a perception from these Nordic countries that there are in fact critical mass of like-minded countries in the continent that would be part of a grouping such as a Nordic one when it comes to these issues of industrial policy and their views on protectionism. I don't know who to start with. It's an open bar. I can throw it out to Kalle for the beginning, and then you can bounce off it if you want to, the rest of you.
Yeah, sure, I can start. I think that there are shared perceptions around Europe on kind of these ideas of having more, be a strong defender of free trade, and having also the internal market and competition rules as they are quite similar to that today. We can see that, of course, the Baltic states are quite similar. We can see that also the Dutch, of course, but also Spain and Portugal are countries that I think that the Nordic states should reach out more to and kind of try to find these new groupings to kind of, to steer the direction. So I think that to reach out to Spain and Portugal and not you always go to kind of the usual suspects would be a way for the Nordic states to act going forward.
Thanks, Kalle. Does anybody want to take up that thread? Yes, Christine, go on.
Yeah, I can maybe add from the perspective of Denmark, because of course this has also very much been in the blood of Denmark to be against protectionism, and that was also why, with the UK leaving the EU, this was just really seen as a post-Brexit risk that the EU's trade policy would become more protectionist, and Denmark was very scared of how to position itself in order to secure a commercially liberal balance in the council, also because Denmark is not part of the Eurozone. And then we have seen, as has already been mentioned, the Danish approach has been to pursue a much more ad hoc kind of way, not least working with the Frugal Four, trying to still sort of push this method forward. Though I would say we also see across Europe, obviously, with the EU directive on investment screening, and this has also recently been an act adopted in Denmark, that there is a change. At least this is a significant change from a Danish perspective to also view world economy through sort of a security perspective. This is a new thing in Denmark, where you actually realize that that trade should also sometimes be seen in a security perspective. And I think that the new Investment Screening Act is a very good example of that. And it was interesting to see the parliament debate on this, because just a few years back it was been created major controversy, but this was not the case at all. It was just passed by all parties. And this is despite the fact that it really introduces an entirely new regime in Danish legislation since foreign investment has not been subject to any sort of regulation from a Danish perspective. So just to add, I know I'm a security researcher, but so maybe this is also just what I see. But I think it's an interesting perspective that there's also a little bit of change there.
Thank you, Christine. Over to you, Niklas.
Yeah, if I may add, I think one thing to watch is how the dynamic between Germany and France is developing there in the future. And I'm not only saying that because Germany is the country I know best, but traditionally, Germany, when it comes to this industrial and economic and trade policies, has been very like-minded to the Nordic countries and also especially to Finland, and was an ally when it came to the question of fiscal measures, but also when it comes to being a counterweight on some of this industrial policy suggestions coming from France. But I think in recent years we have seen a little bit of a new dynamic. It's not quite clear yet where this dynamic is heading to, but with the, for example, next generation EU budget, where Germany came out quite forcefully together with France to have a large fiscal stimulus that took many in the Nordic countries by surprise, and and triggered the question whether Germany seeks to closer cooperate with France on some of these more industrial policy initiatives. And of course, there has been also the industrial policy initiative in that case. So I think the jury is still out yet. I mean, the new government in Germany, of course, underlines, as Christy also said, the European sovereignty, and also is quite outspoken on some of the emerging technologies for Europe to play a bigger role: quantum computing, artificial intelligence, these issues. But so the question for the Nordic countries here is how is Germany developing, and is to what extent is Germany going to remain in its corner, and how can this partnership evolve in the future?
If I may still say something from the Finnish perspective, I think the point that Christine made about Denmark very much applies to Finland as well. So, for example, this idea of foreign investment screening, when it first came up in the EU debates, the Finnish view was highly critical. So the Finnish government of the time simply said that this would only lead to this kind of a protectionist spiral, and now we see a completely different take on that. So in the Finnish context, this idea that economics and foreign security policy can no longer be fully separated from each other, it's certainly there, looming in the background in all debates nowadays, and it also, I think, reflects how Finland's view of China has evolved over the last years. So there is a much more critical tone when Finnish policymakers discuss China. Christy, you very correctly pointed out that when it comes to regional security, which is a really big concern in Finland, so far Finland's aspiration and the reality really don't meet, and I think we can very well see that when it comes to Finland's participation in these PESCO projects. So ideally, these PESCO projects would be something that would very much strengthen Finland's and Europe's military capabilities in a way that would also have an impact here in the Baltic Sea region. But Finland has so far only joined these 5 projects, which tells that there are actually rather few projects on this long list of PESCO projects that actually fit the Finnish interests. And so I think this Finnish idea of the EU as taking responsibility for its own territorial security is still only an aspiration. But of course, you also rightly said that this area of countering hybrid threats is something that is of interest to all the Nordic states, and that's definitely been one of the priorities in Finland's security and defense engagement lately. I also fully agree with you when it comes to your assessment that the civilian side has not been mentioned that often in Finland anymore. Maybe the current government is a bit more interested in the civilian aspects, but basically for the last few years, I think security and defense has been discussed actually only in this hard military context, and that has to do with this regional security situation that we have seen since the start of the Ukraine crisis.
I think that Sweden directly after kind of Brexit really tried to become even closer to Germany and tried to we need to build our relations with Germany now after we have lost the UK as our big partner in the EU. But now we see with the next generation EU package, with kind of industrial policy suggestions and so on, that maybe Sweden and Germany are further away than we used to. And I think that hence Sweden really needs to think about this and to build these new groupings to kind of balance also the Franco-German engine if we want to have influence going forward. So,
thanks a lot. I would like to bring up another subject now that is sort of a red line in all these contributions, and you get to jump on it any way you want to. It's about transatlanticism, which is described as something that is a bit frosty, a bit difficult to describe these days, and should not be undermined by this, as Christine put it through her sources, this toxic conversation or rhetoric about strategic autonomy. I would like to ask you to talk about this at further greater length. What is it? What is the transatlantic link? What are the main pillars of the transatlantic link, and what is that? Where does it stand today, and what are the pillars that need to be strengthened, and how can individual countries go about to do that? Because it's a concept such as strategic autonomy, but I'm not quite sure what it actually is. Is it a momentary lapse of reason in form of Trump, or is it a structural thing in the transatlantic relation that needs to be strengthened and not undermined? So, bars open.
If I can just start, maybe from a Finnish perspective, the Finns are always quite pragmatic. So transatlanticism from a Finnish, especially security and defense perspective, is really about concrete cooperation, industrial cooperation and defense cooperation. And despite, of course, the difficult domestic situation in the US and of course the Trump presidency, there has been a deepening of this bilateral cooperation. Of course, Finland not being a part of NATO, together also with Sweden in a trilateral defense pact. And I think the latest, of course, example of this bilateral deepening of transatlantic relationship is Finland's decision to go for the F-35
aircrafts to purchase those and then make a sizable order of that. So it is a very kind of, it's not for Finns, it's not a concept kind of just reserved for Sunday speeches, but for something that has practical implications in terms of ensuring interoperability, in terms of ensuring cooperation, and also in terms of ensuring industrial links. And for example, with this F-35 fighter jet program, that means also deepening of industrial cooperation, defense industrial cooperation. And that is why also Finland was quite outspoken of having possibilities, or at least have the European Defence Fund not impeding those industrial cooperations with third parties. So it comes really down to practical issues for Finland.
Thanks a lot. Anybody else wants to jump in? Yes, Christy.
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, for the Baltics, it's of course the biggest question in this whole discussion, and one where we still have a lot of political confusion and also sometimes misunderstandings. And I think what is important to note now during the Biden administration is that the US has actually become much more favorable to the notion of European strategic autonomy, especially since it is defined as a way to strengthen European capabilities and European responsibility, and also thereby to make Europe more relevant partner for the US and more capable and interesting partner. So the US attitude has changed, and at the same time, the same expectation from the US that has been there for decades, that Europeans should do more, it's very much there. And then the question is, what would make the Europeans really do more for their own security and defense? I think the Nordic countries have been taking some pretty serious steps, but that's not the case for all European countries. And the level of defense spending, you may argue it's a problematic measure, but it is a very concrete measure, and it is low on average in the EU member states. So it's really the member states that need to do much more. And then the additional question is how to use the EU framework to make member states do more, and in a more kind of cost-effective way, so that the European landscape in defense capabilities would not be so fragmented. And as Niklas said, Finland has this pragmatic approach, but then also I would add that both Finland and Sweden actually, in spite of their neutrality background, have this very long-term strategic view on the importance of the US presence in the Baltic Sea region as a factor that contributes to regional security and stability. And so really the question is then how to move ahead with the EU defense cooperation in a way that does strengthen the transatlantic link. And the kind of concern that we have also been talking about for many, many years is that the US turns its attention more and more to the Indo-Pacific and to China, and then that might lead to its diminishing presence in Europe. But in the Baltic Sea region, thus far, we don't see signs of that. On the contrary, the US presence has increased and the cooperation has even increased. But then, and that is the kind of question that is politically something that in the Baltic states, politicians won't even want to raise in public, the question that what if the US actually starts to diminish its presence in our region? Are we ready for that? And what should we do in order to be more prepared for that? It's not an option that I think any of the Baltic Sea countries would choose, but it may happen one day, and it might even happen very abruptly if we have another change of administration in the US that has a Trumpian or something close to Trump view on global security. So that's the question we should really think hard about in this region, how to make ourselves more prepared for this possibility, which we don't want to materialize, but that may actually happen one day, of the US kind of reducing its role in the region.
Sounds like one of the key fears is that the weakening of this transatlantic link will not necessarily come from Europe, but from the US, from the last part of what you said. Christine, we need you to come in.
Yeah. So from the perspective of Denmark, because as I said in my presentation, there's no doubt that the transatlantic link relationship is really seen as the most important one. And nothing really seems to break this understanding. As I've described, Trump was really just seen as a bump in the road, even though we now look towards 2024, dreading that. And I was also interesting to see that in response to the August crisis, Denmark was actually out supporting the United States. And that also means that Denmark is actually in quite a difficult situation right now, trying to figure out how to strengthen the transatlantic relationship. We have now seen, following the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, that Denmark has for decades tried to sort of follow in the footsteps of the American military activism, but that's no longer such a great priority for the US. So what should Denmark and Europe do to retain the transatlantic link? Should we also become engaged in the South Pacific Sea? Should we also sort of adopt a more aggressive stance towards China? Where should we position ourselves? That's a debate very much going on in Denmark right now. And I actually just got back from the United States, from Washington, the day before yesterday, where I was visiting to talk to policymakers about how they view strategic autonomy and the endeavor that Europe is at least trying to pursue right now. And very much as Christy said, there's no doubt that that they, for the first time, and it's not that long ago actually, that they were very critical. Even in the first couple of months of the Biden administration, they were much more critical towards the idea and towards the initiative. And now they're just really underlying everyone I talk to. Maybe there are still some critical voices in the Pentagon, but everyone I talk to really stressed that they see actually Europe strengthening strategic autonomy as a prerequisite for future transatlantic relationships. So they're changing their views on this very much. And then, of course, we also have a situation where there's very, very little consensus on foreign policy in the US, and there's probably only one issue where there is consensus, namely that Asia should be sort of the main priority when it comes to broader foreign and also security policy. And what everyone was also very much sort of stressing, which was a little bit a surprise to me, was that they would want sort of Europe, or maybe not such a big surprise, but they would want Europe to do much more in their own immediate neighborhood, so resources was sort of freed for them to concentrate on Asia. And everyone was also very much strengthening or sort of emphasizing that the transatlantic relationship is undergoing change. So Europe must sort of relate to that and respond to that. Thanks.
Kalle, please.
I just wanted to firstly echo a lot of Niklas' comments on the transatlantic link. Sweden and Finland, I think, that have quite similar approach to the US in that sense, and also echo Christy and Christine's comments that the US has become more positively on the concept of strategic autonomy. But we'll see that the Swedish government always in the discussions on strategic autonomy will will add that the transatlantic link is crucial for Sweden and Europe's security. But I think that we, and echoing Christine's comments, that we need to think about what will kind of the US even more pivot to Asia in that sense mean for Europe in the long run, for our security and our responsibility in that sense.
I think that will conclude today's exercise. Many thanks to all of you, all of the people who have been watching us, and our technicians and our presenters, Niklas, Kalle, Christine, Christy, and Thomas, for writing a wonderful wonderful report, and Christy for taking the time to be with us today to give us her comments on these issues. And I hope that the next time we discuss these things, maybe I'll follow up, we will do it in person, but during these circumstances now, this will certainly have to do. So we conclude with the understanding that we have the American blessing to approach as one form or another of strategic autonomy. Let's see what direction it takes the next couple of months. Until later, from CEPS, thanks a lot again, and please do go visit our website to look at the report. And many thanks again. Bye, guys.